This is recorded. It will be on the Pasadena Royal channel, and the way that today's town hall is going to work. Steve is going to give us a presentation. Afterwards, there will be a time for questions and answers. If you have a question, please put it in the chat box, and I will keep track of that. So take it away, Steve. And for those of you who don't know Steve, Steve Mermell is the city manager for the city of Pasadena, and he's been with the city, I believe, over 30 years now.
32.
32 years.
I'm worried it's beginning to turn my hair gray.
You should have access to share your screen now.
Aha, okay, let's try this. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. It worked. So first of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me tonight. Can you hear me okay? Sorry. Well,
yes,
thanks for inviting me. In my 32 years in the city, I've been involved with the city's budget for probably 25 or more of those years. I was in the finance department for a long time. I was the budget administrator for maybe 6 or 7 years and finance director off and on for maybe 3 years. So I've been involved with the budget a lot. And over the years, I've had occasion, and there's been lots of discussions about to get public interested in the budget. And we set meetings and we send things out. And the truth of the matter is the public doesn't seem terribly interested in the budget. So I want to thank you all for having enough interest in the budget to tune in this evening. So it's gratifying for me to see people who actually want to understand a little bit about the budget. I'll talk about the budget process a little bit, but it's really sort of a combination of the budget process and the city's financial picture, because those two really go hand in hand. So let me jump into it. So really, the city has two different budgets. Each one of them is a spending plan. And that's all a budget is. It's just a plan. It can get changed. Any Monday night that the council meets, they can amend the budget. In fact, during the year, they frequently do amend the budget because things change. So our two budgets are the capital improvement program budget. And this is not what most people think about when they think of the city's budget. But this is it's a 5-year rolling plan for investment in the city's infrastructure, streets and parks, the power system, the water system. It's all the infrastructure. Those type of projects are in the capital improvement program budget. So it's major investments in city infrastructure. In any given year, we set aside about $90 million towards capital projects. But hardly any of it is general fund dollars. And in a few minutes, I'll talk more about the general fund. Most of it is coming from the power utility, the water utility, gas tax money, non-general fund sources that are restricted and can only be used for certain things. So hardly the only general fund that we've been able to put in the capital budget in recent years is $1 million a year we've been putting in for sidewalks. We have obviously a problem with broken sidewalks. The trees are beautiful, but they uplift the sidewalk. We get occasional claims from people who've tripped in the sidewalk. So we've been putting $1 million a year. It was estimated a few years ago that we had $13 million worth of sidewalk work to do. We're probably down to about 7 or 8 million. So we've been trying to catch up to it. The capital budget is a long-term investment. Think about it like taking care of your house. Every 20 years, you got to put on a new roof. Ever so often, you have to paint. That's where you budget for this stuff. What most people think about when they think about the budget is the operating budget. Here's our lovely operating budget. That funds the ongoing operations of all the city departments and the 3 operating companies. We have 3 operating companies in the city. They're semi-autonomous. One of them is Pasadena Media. Thank you for being here tonight. Another one is the Rose Bowl Operating Company, runs the Rose Bowl Stadium and runs the golf course. And then there's the Pasadena Center Operating Company that runs the convention center. So the city has over 130 different funds. Funds are separated, segregated dollars that can only be used for certain things, over 130 of these, but it's the general fund that gets most attention. That's what people think of when they think of city services. It pays for most city services, police, the fire department, parks and rec. 80% of the library operation is paid for by the general fund. So that's really what we're talking about, is the general fund budget. And when the city council appropriates to the budget, they set aside a certain amount of money by department, by fund. So for instance, the fire department's budget is about $50 million. And if we want to move money from the fire department to the police department, the council has to approve it. Or if we want to move money from one fund to another fund, the city council has to approve it. So ultimately, they have budgetary control. Here's a little chart of the current year adopted budget and the last year's adopted budget and 2019's actual expenditures. So you can see the general fund budget in the current year is just under $270,000. And if you add all of our funds together, it's about million and $878 million. That's a lot of money. It's a big operation. And you can see that we have about 1,000, what we call FTEs, full-time equivalents, staff in the general fund, and 2,200 plus across the whole city. So to understand the budget, it's good to know where the revenues are coming from and what we spend the money on. The biggest revenues for the general fund, and that's what most of my presentation for the balance of it tonight will focus on, are taxes. Property tax, everyone, if you own property, you pay 1% property tax. The city gets 21% of that 1%. Does that make sense? So people pay a total of 1% property tax, but we get 1% of that. The chart on the right is a breakdown of property tax. When we used to have a redevelopment agency, some of the property tax was retained by the redevelopment agency. It did not go off to the other people who normally get property tax. We would use that money to reinvest in areas that were blighted and needed reinvestment. The governor, Brown, he eliminated redevelopment last time California had a major recession and budget crisis because there was a lot of money there. There was about $13 billion there. The good thing is the general fund started to receive property tax that used to just be earmarked for redevelopment agency. When I used to do the budget, we used to get about 30 million a year in property tax. Today, 20 some odd years later, it's more like 65 million in property tax. Our assessed value in the city has really grown over the years. It's the single largest revenue source. Then we have sales tax. So it's a little complicated here. The base sales tax is 9.5%, and we get 1% of that. Then there's a county pool, and we get 2% of that, and that county pool is 1%. And then we had Measure I a few years ago. Thank you for your support of that. That's a 3/4 cent sales tax. So the city gets all of that, but Measure J was an advisory measure that the voters directed the city council, said, look, if you pass Measure I, you should give 1/3 of the revenue to the school district. So we have a memorandum of understanding with the school district, and we give them 1/3 of the revenue. So we get the full 3/4, we keep 1/2, we give 1/3 to the school district. It's been good for about $24 million a year. So we're giving the school district $8 million and we're keeping the other 16. We have a utility users tax, which varies by utility. Utility users tax and sales tax, good for just under $30 million a year. Obviously, sales tax, and I'll talk about the impact of COVID in a minute, took a big dive this past year. Utility users tax continues to go down as new technologies come online. People who have the dish network, we don't get any utility users tax off of that. And the cost of telecommunications has gone down. So that revenue source is actually going down. The next big one that kind of trails fairly far behind the taxes is the transient occupancy tax. This is the hotel tax. We have a tax rate of 12.11%, but we give 2/3 of that to the Pasadena Center. That pays for the operation of the center and helps them pay the debt service on the expansion they did a number of years ago. There's also a tourism assessment district that all the hoteliers agreed to a number of years ago. That gets added on a hotel patron's bill. So when they look at their bill, it really kind of looks like the TOT is 15%, but 2.89 of that is this separate little T-bid that pays for destination marketing. Okay, so where's the money go? So this is what a lot of people want to know, right? Here's the general fund budget. And on the left is a pie chart where we've categorized some expenditures in the general fund. No surprise, for most cities, police and fire are the biggest expenditures. For us, it's 31% of the general fund is the police department and 20% is the fire department. And then everybody else makes up the other 49%. If you look on the right, and I'm going to move my pictures over so I can say, if you look to the right, you can see a column that says general fund and then all funds, and it lists all the city departments in these broad categories so you can see what everyone's budget is. So for instance, Parks and Recreation Community Service, their total budget is $22,930,000. The vast majority of that is in the general fund, $22,857. So that means they have a little bit of money in some non-general fund. You can see that the Water and Power Department is a very big budget, $291 million, because most of that is purchased power that we buy and then we bring in and provide that to our customers. So you can see, let's take a moment and just let everybody look at that for a moment, and you can see where the money goes. You can see that the administrative type departments, like my department, the city clerk, the city attorney, it's not that big. Finance department's $14 million. You know, so you take all those central services departments, and they're 39 million in the general fund, 69 overall. So this is a good one. And then down below, you see we have our debt service. City has debt. We've been paying off a lot of our debt, but we have debt. And then that number for the Pasadena Center Operating Company, that's the transfer out to them of that transient occupancy tax. Alan, I can keep going, or I can stop and see if anyone has a question on any of this. What's your preference? You got to unmute yourself so I can hear you.
Where is Nicole? She's
I'm here. If anybody has a question regarding the budget, go ahead and type it, and let's give people a minute. This is a lot to take in.
It is. And so, Steve, will these slides be available for distribution at the end of this presentation?
Yeah, Nicole has it, and I would ask her to email it out to everybody, or however you guys distribute it. But yeah, absolutely. And I have a few more slides. I'm happy to jump back, so I'll keep plowing through here. You guys just tell me when to shut up. So when we talk about the budget, and I know you wanted to talk about how to get involved in the budget, but I think we need to talk about, and you and I talked about a little bit this afternoon, Alan, about the city's financial picture. Mm-hmm. When I get to the end of the presentation, I'm going to tell you all how you can get involved in the budget hearings. But the truth of the matter is you can get involved on the city's budget anytime, in that you can get up to speed on it. You can learn where the money's going. I'm accessible. Our finance department is accessible. We have a great finance director, Matt Hawksworth. We're happy to share any information with anybody, any resident, anytime about the budget. So don't feel like you have to wait till some magic time to get engaged. Obviously, there's a certain time to talk to the city council about it in a public forum, and I'll review that with you. But you can get involved anytime. So let's step back and talk about the big financial picture. Focusing on the city's budget has always been a big deal for me. When I became the city manager, we had a structural deficit, meaning we were spending more money than we were bringing in. That is not sustainable. Everything we do in the city is predicated on having the financial resources to do it. So we cut $6 million over a couple of years, and then we went to the voters on Measure I. And it was a tremendous success. The support for Measure I was great. We only needed 50% plus one. I think we got 68% support. And I thought, well, that's just great, because now we have enough money in our operating budget to reverse the structural deficit. And we actually had additional money that we could use for some much needed capital improvements. We have fire stations in the city that were built in the 1950s, and they're just not up to standard. There's concerns that how will they weather an earthquake? And we have other buildings in the city that need investment. So going into fiscal 21, the current year, we were going to put $8.4 million of the Measure I money into capital projects. We were going to do more sidewalks. We were going to do all kinds of great things. And then, of course, what happened? COVID came along and our revenues tanked, and we had to reallocate that money to avoid having to make big cuts in our services, to avoid cutting the fire department, Parks and Rec, the library, police. So we couldn't do those big projects we wanted to. But before COVID came along, it was looking pretty good. We never had a lot of room to take on new initiatives. New initiatives cost money. My caution to the city council has always been, if we want to do something new, that's great, but we should find something that we don't need to do anymore. A lot of the services we provide because we've been doing it a long time, and maybe we don't need to do it anymore. I mean, we used to have an office in the then Human Services Department. It was called Neighborhood Connections, and it helped neighborhood groups organize. And it did great work, don't get me wrong. But in today's day and age, we have Nextdoor, we have social media. There's all kinds of ways for people to connect now. So is that an office we still need, or could we use the money for better effect elsewhere? And that's the kind of discussion. So things were looking pretty good. And then COVID came along, and it just knocked everybody for a loop. In the general fund alone, between last fiscal year and this fiscal year, we lost at least $30 million. And if you add in all the other funds, it's probably $70 million. When we look at events at the Rose Bowl and the Convention Center we're going to host, the parking funds, no one was using our parking garages. We suspended parking citations. So probably about $70 million loss overall. Excuse me. And then we spent a lot of money responding to COVID. We set up a temporary care facility at the convention center in case the hospital were to overflow. And thank goodness we didn't need to use it, but it still cost $750,000 to set that up and just have it available. So if you add up all that we've spent, it's probably $20 million in the general fund and $30 million overall. Our health department, Nicole can tell you, it's a small but mighty group. It's only about 100 people. And we had to do all this contact tracing for COVID. Well, I reassigned the librarians. because libraries are closed. So we reassign the librarians to help with contact tracing. So, that's a reallocation. You could chalk that up as an expense as well. Now, we're hopeful. The federal government has promised us $52 million in relief. We're learning a little bit more about that relief, what we can use it for, how much the city can keep, how much we're expected to pass on to residents in the form of, say, rental assistance, utility assistance. And we're hoping to get FEMA reimbursements for the money we've been expending on the pandemic. But when you think about FEMA, normally it's in the wake of a disaster. In California, it's an earthquake. In the Southeast, it's a hurricane. They're localized disasters. COVID is national. So every city is going to be asking FEMA for money. So I'm still a little wary about whether we'll get the FEMA money. And in years past, when we've had disasters, sometimes the money comes in 5 years downstream, 7 years downstream. In the meantime, you got to put that money out. So we'll see. We'll see if we get that money. But I do believe we'll get the 52 million, just trying to learn how we can use it. But as you can see, based on what we've lost and what we spent, it only sort of gets us back maybe to where we were, which if we could get back to where we were pre-COVID, I'll be happy with that. But now let's talk about the future. So for next fiscal year, the departments start putting their budgets together really like in January. And for the last 3 weeks or so, I've been reviewing with all the departments their proposed budgets. Every year, the cost of doing business goes up a little bit because the cost of insurance goes up or utilities goes up, our contributions to the pension system goes up. But I've told the departments that they really need to have a status quo budget. This is not the time to come in and ask for a bunch of new positions because there's still too much uncertainty. If we get downstream a little bit and we can get the federal money and things are looking good, well, then we can revisit some of the things that people wanted to do. But the council has to adopt a budget by the end of June. And where we're standing today, April 1, I still really don't know. There's a big question about what the speed of the economic recovery is going to be. Some people have suggested, just like following the Spanish flu pandemic 100 years ago, that we'll have the roaring 20s all over again. That there's all this pent up demand for spending and people are going to go out and they're going to spend their money and they're going to travel, and that would be good. The Anderson forecast has suggested that by the second quarter of this year, economic growth is, I think, about 2%. Then they think by the third quarter, it jumps up to 6%. And by the fourth quarter, they expect it to drop down to a more sustainable level of 3%. So that would be really kind of a V-shape, big drop, and then good recovery. We'll see if that happens. So that will have a big bearing on the city's budget. Now, even if things recover, I expect there's going to be some lagging impacts from the COVID recession. A lot of businesses have closed, a lot of restaurants have closed. Some of them are not going to come back. Other people will take their place, but that may take time. I was reading today that the hotel industry is now thinking they won't be back to pre-pandemic until 2024. So that's a few years out. And it's conceivable that we may still have high unemployment for a while. One thing we've really seen is the unequal distribution of pain in this pandemic. People at the lower end of the spectrum are really getting hurt, a lot of unemployment. The city council stepped up, provided a lot of money for food banks to help feed people. We may still need to be doing that for a while, and it's obviously a worthy endeavor. But the biggest thing that concerns me the most looking out into the future are the Rose Bowl and the Convention Center. And I'll tell you why.
So I'm going to go ahead and stop you.
Go.
Just because we have a lot of questions coming in. So the first question is, what other sources of revenue are available to the city?
Well, we don't get income tax. We don't really get much from the state. We get a little bit of like gas tax from the state. I mean, for the most part, the other revenues we have are things like charges for services. If we pick someone up and transport them to the hospital in one of our ambulances, then we'll bill their insurance company. We don't collect 100% of what we bill. We collect maybe 50%. We charge people, of course, to use our facilities, but you don't want to make it too expensive for your local residents. So for park usage and our programs and our summer camps, we tend to try to keep those costs low. And for people who don't live in the city who want to use our facilities, we try to charge more of a market rate. For the most part, I think we're hitting all the revenue sources we really could hit. And it's just a matter of, okay, this is where we're getting revenue, and it's all we can do to keep getting that. As I mentioned, the utility users tax has been decreasing. There was a big change with sales tax recently. It's called the Wayfair decision. Wayfair is an online retailer, and Supreme Court ruled that the sales from those online sales needed to be shared with the states equally. So we started picking up a lot more sales tax from that. So that's good. So if you look in the city's budget online, you can see hundreds of different types of revenues, and some are really small, everything from yard sale permits all the way up to property tax. I hope that answered the question. Tell me if it doesn't.
Thank you. So the next question is, can we use part of the infrastructure and land use budget, about 11%, to do training and workforce development in the Pasadena area, specifically for the African-American community, for training solar installers, electricians and landscapes?
If I understood the question right, it was, could we use some of the capital budget to pay for training?
Yes.
So in a way, a lot of those projects require, so we don't do a lot of the construction ourselves in the city. We bid it out. We hire contractors. And many contractors have to comply, if they're a union contractor, they have to comply with their union agreements. The state has apprenticeship requirements for contractors, and they need to adhere to those requirements. Chris is on the line, knows a lot about those. And the city does try to engage with people to make sure that the contractors are following those state requirements. If the question is, can the city fund a new program for job training? I should mention that we're one of the several cities that are part of the Workforce Development Board. And actually, the employees at the Workforce Development Board are Pasadena employees. And this is a consortium of cities that receives a federal grant to do job training. And so the best place to look, rather than reinvent things, is to learn about what the Workforce Development Board does. And Diane Russell operates that program for us. And I would recommend that you invite her to come talk to the group about all the good things that they do, because they help people with job training. They also help with employees that are getting dislocated when there's layoffs. They help them with some quick refresh on skills and help them get reemployed.
Thank you. You can continue on, and we'll ask some more questions in a second.
Okay, so let me get to the thing that keeps me up at night. That's the Rose Bowl and the Conference Center. So this chart is a chart of the debt service for both the Rose Bowl, it's the red line, and the Conference Center, it's the blue line. So as I mentioned, a number of years ago, I guess maybe now it's 20 years ago, we did a redo on the Convention Center, and we issued $164 million in bonds to pay for the work. And then a couple of years ago, well, I guess maybe it's now 7, 8 years ago, time flies, we issued maybe $180 million in bonds to do the work at the Rose Bowl, to build the new, it used to be called the press box. Now it's, what do we call it? The new thing at the stadium. So obviously during the whole COVID thing, neither the PCOC or the RBOC has really been able to have events. So they've been losing a lot of money. For the Convention Center, they've been able to reduce their expenses, and they had some money in the bank, maybe 10 million bucks set aside. So they're able to cover their debt service. And remember, we give them 2/3 of the hotel tax. Of course, the hotel tax has been really low this year, but they are getting some revenue stream from the city. So they're able to keep it together, and they haven't been a burden on the city. We'll need to see if it's going to stay that way. I'm hopeful that within a year, they're able to have events again, and people are staying in the hotels again, and they're getting their revenue, and they can pay for their debt and not need to come to the city and ask for support. The Rose Bowl has been doing very well with the golf course. Golf course has been doing better than ever during the pandemic because it's one of the few things people can do. But the debt service payment from that project to build that new pavilion is extensive. If you look at the chart, you see that in fiscal 21, that number is 11.5 million. And every single year it goes up by about $400,000. So the Rose Bowl always knew that it would be a challenge to generate enough revenue to meet this growing debt. Now, of course, no one foresaw COVID just choking off events. So we'll get past COVID, but the longer term concern, there's a brand new stadium in Los Angeles, and that's going to suck away some of our business. And it's not like we're getting new tenants in the bowl. UCLA football hasn't really been that fabulous. The joke is, with the number of UCLA fans coming to the game, they could social distance in the stadium today. So in the current year, we had to dip into our reserves, $11.5 million to cover the debt service for the Rose Bowl. And for next fiscal year, the budget we're putting together now, I anticipate we'll probably need another $10 million to support them. The big question is, in the subsequent year, in fiscal year 23, which will begin July 1 of 2022, and for the years out into the future, how much, if any, will we need to continue to support the Rose Bowl? Because those bonds, just like the bonds for the convention center, were issued in the name of the city. And so the city has to pay that debt. So my biggest concern is if we have to start carving out $3 million, $5 million a year, where is that money coming from? And does that money, in order to get that money, are we going to have to reduce services to our community? The last thing you ever want to do with the budget is cut the budget. It's difficult. Everything we do has a constituency, I guarantee you. To reduce hours of operation at a library, people would be mad. To remove one firefighter from a truck, people would be mad. People want services, they deserve services. It's hard to cut the budget. So this is the scariest proposition we have going. This chart illustrates a bit of what I was saying. Back in February, let me back up and what this is. So we headed into the pandemic in pretty strong financial shape, and I take a lot of pride in that. We had more money than just our reserves. We had money over and above our reserves. And that's what you call unassigned fund balance. That's like having an extra couple of grand floating around in your checking account. So February 28th, we had almost $2.5 million over and above our reserves. We have a 20% reserve that we keep in two handfuls, big handful, little handful. The little handful is what we call the 5% operating reserve. And that's something that we recognize from time to time, you may need to dip into it. As long as at the end of the year, you're solid and you put the money back, you may need to go into your savings sometime to make a big purchase. The 15% reserve is the total lockbox, big earthquake recovery kind of reserve. That's for the really, really rainy day. That's the El Nino day. And then we set up a pension trust a number of years ago. You may have heard that the cost of pensions are rising for local government. And even though in 2013 there was reform and new city employees have a less generous formula, there's still all these old timers like me, and the city's going to have to pay towards those benefits. So we put money aside to help offset the impact of the increase in the pension cost. And that's almost $13 million as of the end of December. So we were looking good end of February. By August 20th, we had burned through all that unassigned fund balance, and 10 million bucks of the 5% reserve went like that. And that was because of the support we needed to provide the Rose Bowl. We haven't touched the 15% reserve, don't want to touch it, hope not to touch it, and we haven't touched the pension trust. And then our estimate for June 30th, the end of this current fiscal year, we were able to put a little money back into our reserve. So it actually dropped below, but we think we'll get back to 2.5 million roughly. And then we still have that 15% reserve, and then we still have the pension trust. But if every year we're going to need to be supporting the Rose Bowl and then potentially the convention center, you can see that you can't do that for too many years before you're out of money. So that's not good. So to me, the big watchword is drawing down the reserves. It's not a fiscally sustainable strategy. You can dip into your savings a couple of times during hard times, but you can't do it long term. And that kind of brings me back to the budget, because development of the budget has to recognize this reality. We have to recognize that we can't just keep adding things without some compensating reductions or be mindful of how much money we really have. I'm such a bummer. So let's circle on back to the budget process itself. The city charter requires that I submit the budget to the city council by the third Monday in May. And I've always made a commitment, that's the operating budget, third Monday in May. I've always made a commitment that I will always give the city council a balanced budget. In years past, we've had budgets that drew down our reserves. I don't like that. I like to give the city council a budget that's balanced. And if there has to be reductions to make it balanced, then I tell them what I think they ought to get rid of. And they can, it's their decision whether to go with my recommendation or not. So that'll be May 3rd that they're getting the operating budget. I'm sorry, May 3rd is the capital budget. They get the capital budget on May 3rd. We're going to try to do that all in one night because there's not a lot of new things there. It's really just a continuation of existing projects. May 17th is when I do my big spiel on the operating budget. And a lot of what I said tonight will find its way into that conversation. So I thank you for letting me try it out on you, and I'll appreciate feedback. And then we have 4 subsequent meetings set up to discuss the budget. Typically what we do is we take an hour or two to talk about the big departments, the fire department, the police department, the public works department. Interestingly, we hardly ever talk about the money. We usually talk about the department's work plan. It's sort of an opportunity for council members to just kind of have sort of free-for-all question time to ask departments about anything. In years past, we've had longer meetings, joint meetings with the city council's finance committee. But again, because we expect this year to be pretty straightforward status quo, we've allotted about 2.5 hours each night. So, maybe 8 to 10 hours of discussion on the operating budget. And of course, any Monday night, we can come back and talk about the budget some more. But that's usually the time to go through, answer the big questions, and adopt the budget.
So I'm going to ask you a question really quick from the community.
I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, so how do departments include the community in the draft budget process? How do the departments include the community in the draft budget process?
Yeah, the truth of the matter is there's not a lot of community involvement in the budget process itself. Now, obviously, departments are engaged with the community. Take the health department, for example, right? Our health department works with the community And based on our knowledge of the community is how we develop our recommended operating budget. The example that I like to give is our health department has a Black infant health program. I think some of you are probably familiar with that. And we get money, used to get money from the state of California. At one point in time, the state of California said, we don't have enough participants in the program. They're not going to give us any more money. The health department says to me, look, we still need this program. This is a vital program. It's important for our community. So we talked to the county of Los Angeles because the county continues to get state money. And we say, would you please break some money off for us so we can maintain our program? And they say, yeah. And if they said no, then I would recommend funding it with general fund because our community needs that service. So it's an indirect involvement. The departments respond to the people they serve. The Parks and Rec department knows what programming our residents want in terms of sports programs and senior programs, and that finds its way into the budget. That's how we do it.
And then really quick, I think you might have touched on this already. Comes from Dan H. How are the allocations to the various city departments decided upon?
So the budget is a very incremental thing. I mean, for the most part, everything we're doing last year, we're going to plan to do next year. And so you take last year's budget and you say, okay, the library had how many people, how many staff? 120. And what was the cost of operating 10 libraries? Okay, that was $14 million. And what are the things that are increasing this year? Okay, so they need a little more money for insurance, a little more money for utilities. And that's largely how it happens. It's very incremental. I'm sure that there's some people that would love to say, let's start from scratch. Back for those of us that remember President Carter, there was a lot of discussion about zero-based budgeting. Start from zero and decide what is it that you want. And that sounds great in theory. It's difficult in practice because, again, most of what you're doing today, you want to do tomorrow. I'm familiar with exercises with communities. Often it's around the hard decisions of making budget cuts, where you go to the community and you say, what are your budget priorities? And you try to use their selection of priorities to determine what they call the keeps, not the cuts, right? So the things that a community says that they're really supportive of, you keep, and the things that there's not so much support for, well, then that potentially, if you have to make reductions, then you make them there. It's still, that's a super difficult thing because any cut is a reduction in service. So it's hard to cut the budget. And I see my job, frankly, as being the guy to try to keep it all together and to not have to put the city council in the position of having to make cuts.
So we're going to stay on the community for a little bit just because it's a hot topic. And there's just been a lot of conversation about community services over the last couple of months. So my next question for you is, how much revenue does the city come from the cannabis enterprises? So I guess how much money will the city make off of the cannabis community?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So when the voters approved our cannabis regulations, they also approved a tax. Right now, there's only 2 cannabis operators that are operating legally. And I think we've been successful in putting all the illegal ones out of business. The illegal ones were never paying our taxes. So there's 2 legal operators. We had envisioned that we would have up to 6. Based on 6, we estimated that we would generate about $2 million a year in revenue. And my thought was that a good chunk of that would go to the health department. Health department today doesn't get any general fund money except for the money for the animal control contract that goes right out the door to the Humane Society. So I wanted to see some of the cannabis revenue go to support our health equity efforts and other things we're doing in the health department. So with only 2 operating, it's not much. We got our first sales tax receipt. I think it was under 200,000. I'm hopeful that we'll get more of the legal retailers open and that we could get more than $1 million. If we have, let's say 4 or 5 operating, maybe we get $1.5 million, maybe $1 million. When you're thinking of a general fund budget of 260 million, it's not huge, but every little bit helps.
So my next question comes from Christy, and hers reads: the department needs to include the community in the draft process. How do we as the community know what how do they as the community know what they want? What were the community needs and priorities assessed at any point in the process?
Yeah, like I say, in the past, I've been involved in surveys asking people about what their budget priorities are, what they're interested in. Look, there's nothing, and I would encourage people to participate and watch the budget hearings, but really the budget gets developed in a way all through the year as we hear from people in the community what services they're interested in departments providing. So I know there's a lot of names on this call that I recognize, and I know that you're in frequent contact with our city departments. I think one of the great things about our departments is how accessible we are to the residents. And, please dialogue with the departments, talk to me, tell me what you think. It all goes into the mix. I know some people like the idea of let's have a big community process about redoing the entire budget. And, that could happen. It would be a challenge. I mean, every single year that we do the budget, most of the discussion is really just on the periphery. If we agree to sort of some fundamental things that we're going to have a fire department, we're going to have 6 fire stations, we're going to staff it 3 shifts a day, 24 hours a day, that is going to cost X amount of money. There's just really no other way around that. We're going to have 10 libraries. They'll be open X hours per day. There's a cost of that. So I'm sure there's some people that would say, well, you need a smaller police department. And that's certainly a position people can take. And, if the city council felt that way, then they would ask me to direct some changes there. I would argue that there's a good reason to have a police department and the many things that they do. But it's this dialogue that I think is happening constantly. And I would encourage everyone to continue to do that.
So you just segue into my next question, and that is regarding the police department, just because I would say for the last year, probably even longer than that, there's been talks about redistributing some of the funds from the police department and it going into other community services such as public health, library. How can the community how can the community redistribute some of those funds from the police department and put into money such as the health department, workforce development, homelessness, and other needed resources?
Sure. Well, again, if you're going to have a police department and it's going to be staffed with the number of officers that we have, which is lower than historical highs, we used to have up to 255 officers in the budget. I think now we're down to about 230 or 235. So we reduced the number of sworn officers. From a budgetary point of view, a police officer with all the accoutrement and all the stuff that comes with it is probably approaching about 200,000 a year from a budget perspective, not a salary perspective, but budgetarily, the overhead and all of that. If you're going to have a police department with the number of police officers we have, and it's going to have police cars, and it's going to have a helicopter, and it's going to have the things that we have, it's going to cost about what it costs. Now, our chief has been really good about underspending, and I'm working with him right now because I want to bring forward a proposal. I think a lot of you are familiar with our port team. Most people, it is a homeless outreach that has social workers and a firefighter assigned to it. And they deal with a lot of our homeless individuals. It's all part of the effort to minimize calls for service for the police department and have non-police response to a lot of these issues. And I'm working with the chief right now to see how we might fund a second port team without having to take more money out of the general fund. So if you will, that's, that would be a reallocation.
Does that port team plan to go 24 hours? Because I know some of the concerns that people in the community have had is that I guess it's only during a certain time. Is that up for discussion or consideration?
Yeah, the current team now is only regular work hours, and that's grant funded, and that grant runs out in calendar year 23. So we're gonna have to figure out how to backfill once that grant goes away. That grant actually came to the health department. So I haven't gotten as far as what hours another team would work. I'm trying to figure out, can we stand up another team?
The next question comes from the chat. If residents expressed a desire for more housing support in the city, what other mechanisms or funds could we use? Is there a way that we can discuss a vacancy tax on residential units? Side note, there's a lot of vacancies in high-end buildings.
Yeah, when you say, housing support, obviously we have our Section 8 program and we have an inclusionary housing program. And that would be a new tax if it was to be a vacant property tax, and that would require a vote of the people. The city council would have to agree to put that on the ballot, and it'd have to be voted by the voters.
Thank you. And then were you done with your presentation?
I was.
Okay, then we can continue with the community questions. Just give me a second. This is another question from the chat, basically stating that right now the community needs support for rent, food, and Wi-Fi. A lot of kids at one point were doing distance learning, as you know. How can we support reallocation funds to address the essential needs of the community?
Sure. Well, food support, the city council has provided at least $300,000, if not more, in food support to our local food banks and the food pantries. And I think that's, been really great. We've also provided rental assistance to tenants of over 275 landlords have received rental assistance. I'm hopeful that this federal allocation will allow us to do more rental assistance, and we're using some of our CDBG dollars for that. So, we have a great housing department. Most cities don't have a housing department. Most cities don't have a health department. And we're using the dollars we have to support. There's certainly more need than we have resources, but our housing department has been really good in providing rental assistance. And again, our parks department has been great. We even assigned staff to help with the food pantries. I suspect that that's something that will continue on. We were part of the Great Plates program that delivered meals from local restaurants to seniors. So the food support thing has been a big deal. We've been giving financial support to Endelon to put together care packages of food for people so they can cook for themselves. So that's been ongoing, and it's been much needed. On the Wi-Fi part, the truth of the matter is the city has looked at municipal Wi-Fi for a number of years. Up until now, there's really no viable financial model to make it work. There's no such thing as free. Everything comes at a cost, and it's just a question of who's bearing the cost. And when we say the city, it's not the city. The city's not a person. The city is the taxpayer, is the resident. So that's your money. And if the city has to subsidize Wi-Fi, then that is an option, but it's an expensive option. Now, Alan sent me an article earlier this morning about 10 a.m. about the president talking about in his $2 trillion infrastructure bill, how he wants to help push out Wi-Fi. So I'm super excited about that. I'd love to see that at a state level, at a federal level. The city of Beverly Hills, which has more money than God, promised that they were going to do municipal Wi-Fi maybe 2 years ago. And last I heard, that whole effort fell apart. So it's tricky. And I owe it to you to be honest with you. That's not a simple one for us to do. So I'm excited about what the president is saying. Maybe there'll be a model. the internet is just like any other utility these days. It's like your water or your electricity. And it probably needs to have a little more kind of regulation on it to protect consumers.
Thank you. So this question comes from the chat. Why are we paying for officers to be present when interacting with people experiencing homeless? Why can't it be employees from the Department of Public Health?
Well, and again, we're studying those models, and we're trying to peel off calls for service from the police department to others. I know, I've talked to a lot of people, I've read a lot of stuff. Conceptually, it's a great idea to say, let's have a team that responds to a call for service of an incident involving, sadly, we all hear about a homeless person having a mental crisis. The challenge, though, there's several challenges. The truth of the matter is sometimes social workers don't want to go into a certain incident unless they have police support. And also, an incident can go from being a mental health crisis to escalating and becoming a very dangerous situation for all those involved. If we knew going into it, if we had perfect knowledge that it's a nonviolent situation for all those involved, then certainly we could dispatch social workers to every one of them. But you don't know often. Most of the time, it's scant information and people are just responding. So, the chief is very supportive of this effort about finding other ways. If we could peel off just like one call for service for, every couple of hours, the chief thinks that we could peel off maybe 8,000 calls for service a year to non-police response. But we have to set it up the right way. We can't just overnight say, okay, boom, call these people. You have to figure out, how are we going to separate when someone calls 911, who is going to figure out whether they dispatch a police officer or dispatch a social worker? You need to have a trained person triage that call. And so we did an experiment with that the other week with the port team. We had someone in dispatch handling calls and then saying, okay, this is one port can handle, this is one PD needs to handle. So we're on this path, and we plan to continue to go down this road to see what we can do to redirect calls.
Thank you. So this is another question regarding the city. What percentage of high-paying jobs in the city infrastructure projects are going to African Americans? Same question for projects that will be received under the Biden infrastructure funds.
Yeah, and again, most of those projects, if we get money to do capital projects, that's going to get competitively bid. And when we competitively bid it under our city charter, we have to award it to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. By law, we can't, because of Prop 209, we can't force that contractor to have any particular workforce. So they will have the workforce that they have. And if they are a union contractor, then how they pick up their employees is a function of their union agreement. Do they go down to the labor hall? I see Ron Matthews is on the call. He knows a lot about this and can explain how it works. But we don't control the workforce of our contractors. That's the truth. And most of the construction jobs are outsourced. They're bid out. They're not done with city workforce.
Thank you. The next question goes back to a question regarding the police department. How many number of officers are needed for Pasadena, and how was that decided?
Well, there was a time a couple years ago, there was a lot of discussion about that. What's the right number of officers? I will say this, because we have the Rose Bowl and we have a lot of events in the city, we probably need more officers than the average city of 140,000, just because of all those special events. Now, those special events, they pay for the officers, taxpayers not underwriting that. But we have so many overtime details. We have so many calls for service. Glendale, I was talking to Alan today about Glendale. They're 40% larger by population, but less goes on there. And they probably have no more officers than we have. They may even have fewer. Pasadena runs at a pretty high tempo in our community. And at any given time, there's not all that many officers in the city. When you think about it, that they work 3 shifts a day. So if you've got 230 officers at any given time, maybe there's 15 vacancies. And at any given time, maybe 5 people are off on a workers' comp injury. And then there's vacation time, and then there's sick time, and then there's people that have desk jobs. Increasingly, we're civilianizing jobs. We just hired our newest non-sworn professional administrator. But when you add it all up, there's not a lot of officers, frankly, patrolling the street at any given time. I'm sure some people would say, philosophically, they feel there's too many. And in any time I've ever been in a neighborhood following a crime, a violent act, and sadly we've had some of those recently, to hear the people talk, we don't have enough officers.
This question is another one from the chat. Do we expect to receive dollars from the federal government via the American Recovery Act? I know you touched on us receiving COVID money of some sort. If you can just further elaborate.
Right. Well, again, we expect to get from the latest round of support, we do expect to get that total of $52 million. We'll see how much we can hang on to, how much we're able to make available for community groups and for residents.
So this is my last question. Can the community members submit their budget ideas to department heads for inclusion in their budgets?
I would ask that you send them to me so I can see them, and then I'm happy to share them out with the appropriate department head.
All right, well, that concludes tonight's town hall. I did want to give a special shout out to our NAACP president, Alan Edson, who is on the call. Did you want to say a few words, Alan?
Thank you, Steve, for the presentation. It's quite informative. Expect a lot of follow-up questions. I want to thank everybody in attendance. I hope this was helpful in seeing how the city of Pasadena constructs their budget. And hopefully you guys got some ideas on how to share some of your ideas to be included in the budget. So thank everybody for attending. And again, Steve, thank you.
And Alan, if I may, I'm kind of high in the chat and I'm seeing some of the comments there. Look, I'm easy to get a hold of. And if anyone wants to talk to me offline, I'm happy to do that. I don't think there's anybody I have ever not spoken to. And I get it, everyone has their opinion, and that's a good thing. It's a healthy thing. So if you want to talk to me, give me a call, shoot me an email, and I'm happy to connect up with you either virtually or in person.
All right, well, thank you guys all for coming on this town hall. I did have leave Steve Mermell's email in the chat. As he said, let's continue this conversation. I hope that the information that was shared tonight was helpful. If you do want a copy of the presentation, email info@naacppasadena.org, and I'll make sure to get that out. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Nicole.